All right, class is in session. Thanks for tuning in to the first episode of the year of the Culture Bomb with Dr. Phoenix. I'm your co-host Sigma Jones. First and foremost, we just want to give a shout out to our subscribers. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for tuning in. We truly appreciate the love and support. Happy New Year to all y'all listening in this evening or this morning, depending on where you are listening in around the world. Man, this is part three of the Black Cult series of the Culture Bomb. And so we're really going to get into a lot of the data and stats on tonight because, as you know, Dr. Phoenix, he does come in with a lot of heavy hitters. And tonight is definitely no different. So without further ado, allow me to reintroduce once again the main doctor of the hour, and that is Dr. Phoenix. Happy New Year's to you, sir. How's it going?
Happy New Year's to you as well. Happy New Year's to all the brothers of all the Ronins, all the brothers of all the brothers listening in to the Culture Bomb, and to everyone who will be listening in to the Culture Bomb, whether it's live or on the replay. I do wish everyone a happy New Year. Hope everyone has been enjoying the holidays thus far, and looking forward to to an interesting 2023 to say the least. there's a lot of things that are going to be, there's a lot of moving parts going on in American society, and certainly within Black America. Specifically, the focus of tonight's stream, we're going to be looking at literacy issues and and education. So this one's going to be coming in hot and heavy. There's quite a bit of information that Sigma Jones and myself will be going through, and so going to be moving a little fast. But this one is going to be a heavy one, and it's not lost on me too that there's a few things that have been going on over the past couple weeks, namely issues with some well-known hip hop artists, entertainers, if you will, and their children. I do plan to address that at some point, um, because I think this is that would that those situations are certainly tailor made for the culture bomb. And the things that I like to talk about, and certainly a lot of the issues that Sigma Jones and myself we do get into, is really issues around being being cautious of who Black men give their seed away to. Who do you impregnate? Are you impregnating the first woman that spreads her legs for you? And ultimately, this woman goes on to destroy your children because she hates you. And so we've seen this going on now for quite some time, but there's a very prominent hip hop. I guess some people would kind of consider him a legend within the arena, even though he was never a famous hip hop artist or rapper himself per se. But certainly some of the things that he's done in the industry have been, I guess you would consider legendary of sorts. But nonetheless, those are things we do plan to touch on at a later date. But tonight's stream is actually going to coincide with a lot of things you see going on. Specifically, I'm sure everyone, if you're not familiar with the ongoing case that the Supreme Court will be ruling on in the affirmative action case against Harvard University. And there's a few things going on there. Now, I will say this. One, it is in regards to Asians being denied entry into Harvard, and they're claiming that lower performing students were allowed entry over them because they were such high scoring students. And I will say this: there's a lot of moving parts in that case. There are a lot of actors who are not in the forefront, who are behind the scenes. But at the same time, there's also things that Black folks in America have failed to do appropriately. And tonight's stream will begin to delve into some of these things that, when it comes to preparing your children to getting out here and doing battle academically, because those are going to be the first battles that your children will fight. It's going to be in the classroom. And there have been some very clear and distinct failures on the side of Black America, and how Black children have been socialized and culturalized, if you will, into a really a culture, really just academic mediocrity. And how even at some of the earliest of ages, it plays out in their lives and it has detrimental effects. But with that said, I think we're good. I think I'm good on that, unless Mr. Jones has something he wants to add to that. I think we can move into the first bit of data we got here. So
Yeah,
for our first,
not a problem. Break it up right now. The first article of the night. So feel free, sir, to take it away.
yeah, so this is from WABE. This is the radio station, the public radio. This is also associated with the Georgia State University, also known as GSU. So if anyone in Georgia or in the Atlanta area familiar with the with Georgia State, know that Georgia State is in the main campus is in the downtown area, what would be considered the downtown area of Atlanta, which actually happens to be a bit of a dicey area for folks who haven't been there, for folks who are familiar with the area. The area is a little dicey, but nonetheless, Georgia State is one of the major universities in the state of Georgia, and certainly within the city of Atlanta. And there was a recent study that they had conducted studying the academic effects of students who went from in-person learning to online learning and back to in-person learning. And what comes to find out, what they discovered is that ultimately had relatively no effect. So I guess we can start here. So mind no scrolling up, sir. All right. A recent study from the Georgia State University shows that the return to in-person learning didn't substantially improve student achievement in Clayton, DeKalb, and Fulton counties. So just to make it really clear, when you're looking at Clayton, DeKalb, and Fulton, specifically Fulton includes some of your highest income neighborhoods, including Buckhead, Midtown. All of that is part of Fulton County. DeKalb includes like Decatur and all that stuff. So yeah, that's part of the that's the area where Emory is at, the CDC is at, stuff like that. But just a quick reference. Tim Sass is the director of GSU's Metro Atlanta Policy Lab for Education, also known as MAPLE, which conducted the research. He says achievement increased a little once students returned to school, but not much. What we found was that the return to in-person learning sort of stopped the decline in achievement growth, but there wasn't much improvement, he says. So things kind of bottom out, pardon. In-person learning alone doesn't seem to be enough to get kids back to where they were pre-pandemic. DeKalb and Clayton counties stayed remote longer than Fulton, which offered a hybrid model at the beginning of the 2020-2021 school year. One thing really quickly, they're saying that in-person learning alone wasn't enough to get children back to pre-pandemic learning, to where they were pre-pandemic, excuse me. And there's a few reasons that at least I hypothesize for that. One is that what essentially goes on in Black America when it comes to education and academic performance is that much of that is offloaded onto the school itself, meaning that modern parents feel that they have no role in their child's education other than I drop them off at school. The school is the quasi babysitter, or when they're at home, the iPad, iPhone, whatever, the computer, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook are their babysitters. And so it is my theory that for the longest time, that because schools have supplemented so much of what should be happening in a home, but they're doing it in schools, which also contributes to the fact that, yeah, students are not quite at work. The students aren't where they were pre-pandemic, but where they were pre-pandemic isn't technically any better statistically than where they're at now. They were still at failing levels then, just not failing as badly, but they were failing nonetheless. And because it is my theory that schools have supplemented for so long a lot of the supplemental education that goes on in home, so reading to your children, speaking to your children, not using Ebonics, which we're going to hit that one pretty heavily tonight. These things are supplemented in the school. These initiatives are supplemented in the school. So they've been able to cover up a lot of those inadequacies of parenting or lack thereof going on in the home. And so once students had to go to online learning or a hybrid of learning, essentially you didn't have that barrier. You didn't have that buffer that covered up those inadequacies, And so that's one take I have on. The other take is just simply put that the schools just simply weren't. There were some gains, but the gains were marginal pre-pandemic. We've all anyone that even remotely follows this knows that the research has been very clear for a very long time. We've seen numerous articles year after year stating that Black children are not doing well. They are failing at rates 2 to 3 times that of their non-Black peers, and in many cities, Atlanta included, if you look at the average high school graduation rate for Black children, for adolescents, excuse me, and in particular the males, you're looking at roughly about 35 to 40% of all Black males graduate from high school in many of your major metros. This was certainly true in places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where you had roughly about you had only you had about 65% of Black males fail to graduate high school.
Mm.
You see similar issues in Chicago, similar issues in New York. But the other part of that is too that because these school districts, again, these school districts are based on zip code, but because they're all part of one county or one particular school district, you have higher performing schools whose students are performing at such a high level that their results actually mask the inadequate results from lesser performing schools. So that was some of my theories on that. But you had anything you want to add to that before I continue?
No, you're spot on, Doc. Because for a long time, and we're definitely getting to the data of that later on tonight. But for a long time, there has been this belief, and especially um, amongst the 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 demographic that we're getting into tonight, that children, so to speak, can guide themselves in regards of their education, which is completely false. Children from kindergarten all the way up until the eighth grade, they have no sense of direction of their education. That's that's always been the parents' job to make sure that the kids are guided on the importance of education. Otherwise, as you rightfully pointed out, they're just sending kids to schools just to have a babysitter. And then once they come home, it's just, okay, well, here's the TV or here's the iPod, the phone. You guide yourself in regards of your education.
Yeah, and and let's be clear because I know some of the naysayers out here will say, well, this is systematic white supremacy, and oh, the schools don't get the funding, but funding is truly based off of local income taxes and real estate taxes. School funding is based off of that. So is zip code. It goes by zip code. So idealistically, higher income earning folks who live in higher income earning zip codes pay higher taxes, higher real estate taxes in particular, and those taxes go towards funding those school districts. But if you guys remember in the previous culture bond we did about 2 weeks ago, and I am going to put this graphic back up from the Atlanta Wealth Initiative, where it showed you the average household income of Black people in Atlanta, which is funny because the other day I was at Saks Fifth Avenue, and you wouldn't believe how many Negroes was up in there. Now, I'm sure a number of you folks been to Saks Fifth Avenue. You know what kind of brands you find up in there.
Mm.
But you would think every Negro was sitting on was making $200,000-300,000 a year, and they can afford a $3,000 Louis Vuitton purse out of Saks Fifth Avenue. But if you guys remember the graphic from a couple weeks ago, yeah, the average black household is only worth about $28,000 compared to the average white household, which was around 85,000. The average Hispanic household was around, I think, somewhere around 40 some thousand, something like that. Might have been a little higher, but nonetheless, black folks were at the bottom by a significant margin. But you wouldn't think that if you were a person, you just went out in your everyday life and you were to just anecdotally observe what do black folks do every day in a place like Atlanta, for example.
Mm.
You would think that with all the Negroes riding around in AMGs and M cars and what have you, and Range Rovers and G Wagons, that it would be reflected in black children's performance. And no, it's not. It's the complete opposite. So again, black people have used schools as a quasi babysitter. And specifically, this is an issue of a single parent led households. Because single parent led households have been a direct feeder into the prison system. It is not by accident that if you have upwards of an 80% of black children born to single parent households, and you have roughly about 75-80% of the players in the NFL and the NBA are black. You have about 75-80% of the NCAA players are black. Pick your sport, football or basketball, pick your sport. The numbers are roughly around the same. Some few percentage of differences between the two, but nonetheless, overrepresented. The prison system is mostly filled with black males. That's not by accident.
Mm.
So the single parent led households become breeding grounds for academic mediocrity, school to prison pipeline. We've all heard that phrase before. And feeding of more young black males to the NCAA, NFL, NBA plantation, if you will. I'll use a colloquial term here.
A plantation that is voluntarily accepted, not forced to go there.
Yes.
Let's definitely put a caveat on that.
Yes,
I just find it
absolutely.
interesting how they say these institutions are plantations, but they don't explain how a slave can still make $100 million freely without being forced to participate.
There's something very interesting because my wife and I were having this conversation earlier today. The barriers, I think there's this huge misconception, if you will, that somehow that it is so difficult to financially or academically to surpass white folks. You will find that the barrier is actually quite low. The bar is quite low.
Oh yeah.
If we know that Most folk, the vast majority of people would struggle to buy a 50. Well, we know that the average car price in this country now is around $50,000. So anyone that's brought a car in the past year or so, a new car, I brought two in the past year, so I can tell you, and they all of them, both of them were well north of $60,000 here, and I can tell you right now, if you're looking at buying any vehicle over $50,000, you're at $50,000 or more, you're looking at minimum of around around a $900 to $1,000 monthly payment.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're looking at cars around $60,000 or more. I mean, you're looking at $1,100 to $1,200, $1,300. Now once you start getting around that 100,000, that six-figure mark, you're looking at around a $2,000 payment. So in a lot of places, $1,000 is roughly about what a lot of Negroes will pay for rent if you're living on the less desirable side of town. Or if you're in a more upscale part of town, $1,000 might be half of what you're paying rent. And that's just for a car, and that's not including insurance, gas. And so, yeah. So I'm telling you that, if you're out here in the market, you're buying cars well and deep into that 5-figure range, or even approaching the 6-figure range. Yeah, you're looking at a significant monthly payment, and this is before the Fed raising interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's just continue. So let's continue with this, because I do want to move on, because just something interesting I just want to put out there. Okay. The report says it's not too late to catch students up, but that districts need to act now since federal pandemic funds run out at the end of the 2023-2024 school year. The study also says students most affected by the pandemic will soon reach the 9th grade, where dropout rates are the highest. Excuse me. Okay, really quickly here. Just want to make a couple points. There's no such thing as catching up. Once you fall behind, you're always behind. That's why it's pertinent, as yesterday I heard parts of your stream yesterday, Sigma Jones, where you was doing your year-end shout outs, and you talked about Kide Gakide Jones and his family, and wanting to have a family like his, and why it's so important to be engaged in family planning with the appropriate woman.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, if you pick the wrong woman, it'd be a lifetime of regret, and ideally a lifetime of failure for not just you, but for your children.
Yes, sir.
Because you picked the wrong one, and your child is going to be a statistic you're reading about in articles like this. Because understand something, once it is so important for a child that for you to be able to give your children the best start possible, because if they don't, and they start to fall behind when they're 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age, those critical years of development, if they fall behind in those critical years of development, they will never catch up, because their peers are moving full steam ahead. Meanwhile, your child is playing catch up when your child should be on par with their peers. And so by the time they can even get to just being an average student, now they're back. The students that they should be competing with, those students are in the stratosphere somewhere. And so it's always going to be a game of basically chasing your tail.
Mm.
So once you fall behind, you tend to stay behind.
So
Food for
much
thought.
for the so much for the policy of no child left behind.
Well, that's really what we're going to be getting into tonight.
Mm.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. That is actually the crux of a lot of the some of the research that influenced the No Child Left Behind policy. We're going to get into the crux of that research.
Mm.
I think it's really important to try and target resources to those students so that we don't see higher dropout and we don't see a reduction in graduation, SAS says. SAS says now districts need to focus on things like high dosage tutoring, preferably during the school day. That's where small groups of 2 to 3 students work with a tutor several times a week. Clayton, DeKalb, and Fulton all offer tutoring. DeKalb has a built-in intervention period into the school day. Clayton County has made tutor.com available to all students. Fulton County schools offer high dosage tutoring during the school day, after school, and on Saturdays. Now that's the stick, that's the key right there. How
Mm.
many children, certainly high school aged adolescents, are gonna give up their Saturday?
Ooh,
You can't
yeah.
even get college students to barely give up their Saturdays.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
You really
And
think
God,
you're about to get a high school student to give it up?
and God forbid you ask them to give up their Sunday.
Yeah. And that's the key. That's some of the key things to take away here. You know, in a lot of cultures, you know, not only it is the norm to be in a lot of countries and many cultures, it is normal to be in school on Saturdays.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I, I believe in many of the Asian countries, they go to school almost seven. The only day they have off is Sunday.
Right. And that's if, they some schools allow Sunday off
Yeah,
because, especially like your high end top performing schools, it's 7 days a week.
yeah. You know, I as I've been to Korea a few times, and I know a few brothers who ended up marrying Korean women, and they had children with them, and they children went to schools over in Korea and such like that. And it is common, in for example, in South Korea, for children to be in school practically 7 days a week, because Korea, much like China, has a school system that um, is very extremely competitive. I don't think we understand what competitive school systems are until you study what happens over in a lot of these Asian countries, like
Hmm.
China and South Korea, where school academic performance for those who are great academic performers and the teachers, the instructors that do well at that are rock stars.
Yes,
You're
sir.
celebrities in many of these countries. I mean, you truly do live like rock stars in some of these countries. But more importantly, it's high stakes testing that goes on in these countries where essentially if you can't score an appropriate score on the standardized exam in many of these countries, that bars you from entry into various disciplines and professions. So engineering, many scientific pursuits, STEM pursuits, if you will. Um, but also, more importantly, it bars you from entry to certain schools.
Yes, sir. That's a fact.
I mean, this is true. I know this is true in Japan. It's true in China. True in South Korea. And you even see this is very the same thing over in India. You see it in many Arabian countries. I know for
Hmm.
a fact because I used to live in Morocco. I know for a fact in Morocco have a similar system. Children, adolescents, high schoolers are tested in their last 2 years, and those what they score on those exams it determines whether or not you can go into professions like being a physician, being an engineer, very scientific pursuits. Yeah. So I know South Korea in particular, their schooling system is pretty brutal.
Oh yeah.
There, uh, I would probably say is it is far more. I ain't gonna say far more. I would say it's definitely a tier more competitive than what you would see in China or some other countries in South
Hmm.
Korea. Because
Yep.
basically, South Korea is a much smaller country, and so there's very limited. There's a limited number of good schools. I think the big one is what the Institute of South Korea. I can't remember the exact name of it, but nonetheless, um, there's basically like two or three top tier schools in South Korea that basically you got 99% of students trying to get to.
Yes, sir.
And because many of these, and because these schools in of themselves, they have international ties specifically to the U.S., to the State Department, to a lot of a lot of your defense contracting firms, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and so these schools oftentimes become pipelines for students to get in. They get entrance into these schools. They major in certain disciplines like electrical engineering, computer science. They go into medicine, and they can find entryway into the U.S. into other elite universities, not just your Ivy Leagues, but a lot of your elite public universities like UCLA, my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin,
Hmm.
and they find entryway that way as well into the U.S. And so again, the whole point is that in countries like South Korea, China, India, and specifically if you just focus on South Korea, uh, China, Japan, where studying and academic excellence is just built, is part of the culture. To be really frank here, it is part of the culture, and and because this starts so early in the lives of children, they are getting some of the best starts possible. So it makes sure that they don't fall behind and that they continue to excel, even even if they leave their own country and go somewhere else.
Right. And Isaac Sama, he brings up a good point in the chat. He said, when I was in school, I used to go to two of the honor roll students' homes for tutoring where we didn't have it at school for problems I had trouble with. Seemed like the logical thing to do. And Isaac Sama, here's the thing. And like you said, Dr. Phoenix, this is why, as Kitty Gakade would say, a quality Stargate matters. As parents, you dictate what type of other children or kids your sons or daughters associated with. That's another, as they would say, networking. They started at a young age. Who your kids associate with played a major role when it came down to academics and honor rolls and the likes.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I will tell you something that was some advice given to me. And this advice was given to me when I was an undergrad by a black man who was a physician and a retired Air Force pilot. And although keep in mind, I was in the military, I got out, went to school. So while there were things that I was very good at that I knew I will admit, I really didn't struggle all too much in undergrad. And so that's something most undergrad for me wasn't really a major struggle. Now I did take organic chemistry over the summer, and that was a brutal course to take it over the summer. I would not recommend taking any science course unless it's like a general biology over or something like that over the summer. Anything that's as heavily involved, like any chemistry course, I do not recommend you take it over the summer, especially organic chemistry.
Oh,
I took it over the summer, and that was a brutal course. That was like 6 weeks of of straight hell. I mean, it was brutal. But I would tell you what helped, what when I did it, what helped me was that I got with other folks. And it was basically I had study groups with other folks, and yeah, we ended up doing very well. And that's something that a lot of black students, especially at the collegiate level, and certain that they fail to do. I know this goes on at every level, but I would definitely say at the collegiate level, they fail to get with other students, even if you're getting with other black students, because other
Mhm.
black students don't get with other black students. I can tell you that for a fact. They don't get with other students, whether they look like them, are them, or whatever. They don't do that. And you oftentimes see that black students drop out within the first couple of weeks. Anybody that's ever gone to a major university, especially a major state university, you go to any general science course, pick it, biology, chemistry, whatever, anatomy, whatever. Within the first 2 weeks, the class might drop from like 300 to like 100.
Oh yeah, I can attest to that.
And this is true across the board, whether it's engineering, uh, the entry of first semester calculus, and I kid you not, anyone that's ever gone to a major, gone to a big state university, or just gone to any major university, period, they will tell you, you take these science courses, you pick, it doesn't matter what course it is, the course might be filled with 300 students in about 2 weeks, at least two-thirds of them done disappeared.
Yes, sir. That's a fact.
And so again, if you're invested in making sure your children have the best academic start that they possibly can, because a lot of this isn't, believe it or not, Negroes want to tell you, oh, well, we don't, it's about systematic white supremacy. They get more money. This isn't about school. Most of
Mm.
what happens to children as it relates to them and their school performance and experience happens in the home. The
Mhm.
home life is the direct reflection of how well a child will or will not do academically. But I think we read enough of this article. We can go on to the next one, sir.
All right, coming right up.
And while you're doing that, just really quickly to address some of the brothers' comments in the chat that you posted up. No, I agree. One of the things that I did that was when I was a young boy, um, I my folks used to back in the day. Well, I guess I'm a millennial, but I'm old enough to where there used to be Radio Shacks for those
Nah,
who might be
I remember Radio Shack. Yeah.
yeah, you go to Radio Shacks and they used to have all these do-it-yourself science kits and stuff like that. Um,
Hmm.
but I remember when I was younger, I I started participating in the science fair when I was in the first grade, and so my first project that I did in the science fair was actually based on series and parallel circuits. Because believe it or not, before I even thought about a career in the medical field, for me it was more or less I thought I was gonna I really wanted to do engineering. That was really my first true love was
Mm.
engineering. And so specifically electrical engineering. And so when I did my first project was on the series of parallel circuits. I remember initially I had a little kit that my folks had got me from Radio Shack, but then I turned around, I had got some books from the library because back in those days, you didn't have digital libraries. You actually had to go into the library, use
Hmm.
the Dewey Decimal System, look up books. And so I used to spend hours in the library after school, looking up books, reading books, trying to see how I wanted to get some ideas for a science project. And eventually I came across a book where kind of talked about series and parallel circuits. And eventually I said, well, I told my folks, well, I need to go to the hardware store. So they took me to the hardware store and they got me some copper wiring. They got me a light, like a little light switch, a big, was it the really big batteries. I think it was the 10-volt batteries, if I remember correctly. I think it was the 10-volt, if I remember
Mm.
correctly. Yeah, the big giant 10-volt batteries, if I remember correctly. And essentially, show how you can make an open and closed circuit, using some copper wire, some light, a light switch, some bulbs and some sockets, and basically connecting them either in series or parallel, and showing how you can create open and closed switches. And I actually did that project for probably about 2 or 3 years. And I ended up going to regional science fairs, and so yeah, those are things that were, starting out in the first grade. So again, the average child is somewhere around 6 years old, something like that, when they're in the first grade. So that is kind of somewhat outside of that critical period of development and growth, but in many ways it kind of isn't, because the point is that you're still fostering that. And even then, before then, I had started reading books. My father had gave me a stack of all of his old comics when I was like 3 years old.
Mm.
And so I started out reading comic books when I was very young. He actually gave me a stack of his read of a lot of his old comics, and he gave me a copy of Bruce Lee's Tao of Jeet Kune Do.
Ooh.
Yeah.
How your dad get a hold of that one?
You know what? That's a good damn question.
Because that's a good read, especially by Bruce Lee. That's a good
Yeah,
one.
yeah, yeah. I have the book around here somewhere. It is stashed away somewhere. I don't know where it is, but yeah, I've had that book. Oh man, I've had that book for probably about 30 years.
Wow, that's awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, so he gave me that book, and I've read through that book forward and backwards and upside down and around and every damn thing else. And so yeah, he gave me that a long time ago. But yeah, I never even bothered to ask him where did he get it, where did he get it from. So no, that is a very interesting, that is a very good question, because I've never bothered to ask my father where he got that from. So yeah.
Hmm.
But no, I say that to say that parenting and good parenting and not lazy parenting are all indicators and indicative of how well a child starts off their academic careers. Because make no mistake about it, your academics is a career. It's the first career you will ever have. And more importantly, it becomes an issue where there are a lot of things that happen specifically with Black children in the academic arena that a lot of Black Negroes have not figured out. It follows you throughout your entirety of your academic career. If you children getting placed in special ed, children getting what are known as IEPs, or individual education plans, which are precursors to children getting placed into IEP, special education courses. And those things follow you throughout your academic career, even going into college level, even going to the collegiate level. So, yeah. So let's go to this next one. So this article was written about 2 years ago, um, October of 2020. But so there was a rather controversial study that came out. Some of you all might have just been born when the study was released. I was barely out of diapers when the study came out, but nonetheless, This study was first released and published in I think it was the year of 95 or 96. But essentially, is a phenomenon called the 30 million word gap.
Hmm.
And I'm actually going to go. This article actually goes into, explains it, and this study was controversial for a number of reasons, which we'll get into in this article here in a moment. But also, but for one very specific reason, a lot of Black folks had a problem with it, because we've all heard the term Ebonics, but there's actually a more formal term that's used and by clinicians and folks in the education sector. Because believe it or not, literacy is not just an education issue; it is a health issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned this, and I'm gonna keep saying this. If you really want to put your pulse on what goes on in Black America, go into healthcare. You're going to see it. But let's start off here, sir. Um, in the past few decades, a range of public awareness campaigns have encouraged parents to speak more with their children, sing, talk, and read, also known as STAR, to a young child, cheerleads one, and Talk With Me Baby begs another. Almost everyone agrees it's good for children to hear parents and caregivers talking. This consensus didn't emerge in a vacuum. The public service campaigns are the legacy of a well known study called Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children, more commonly known as the 30 Million Word Gap Study, which concluded that the first 3 years of a child's life are critical to advancing their language development and can have long term impacts on their success in school and in life. I have been talking about this forever.
Yes, you have. I remember.
I have been talking about this. I've talked about this over at the Black Brain Trust. I've talked about this over on Teapot's channel. I have been talking about this basically probably for the better half of the last 2 years, because that's
Hmm.
essentially when I just discovered this uh, Black YouTube, if you will. But I've talked about this ad nauseum about those critical years of development for children. Specifically, I talked about issues around breastfeeding or lack thereof, Black mothers not breastfeeding their children, and how that's not just important for IQ development in in many respects, but more importantly, is important for just physiological development, development of the gut flora system. In other words, you in your gut you have good bacteria and bad bacteria. Now, the good bacteria is responsible for helping you to digest and absorb various nutrients and vitamins. And then you have bad bacteria, which does what it does. Sometimes give you an upset stomach, can cause a number of other issues. But more importantly, when it comes to that critical period from birth to um, to around 3 years of age, realistically, in my opinion, I think that critical period is also up until around 6 years of age, but specifically from birth to about 3 year to around 3 years of age, you can regularly see, you can actually gauge the progress of a child. It can be actively measured. So, but let's continue here. Um, did we lose somebody? Did we lose anything here? Um, I'm not sure if we lost anyone here. I, did we lose? I think we might have lost Mr. Jones here. I'm not sure. Can everyone hear me in the? Okay, I was just curious if anyone can hear me here. Okay, okay, good, I got it. Okay, there you go. All right, well, I'll just continue reading. This consensus did not emerge in a vacuum. Oh, well, I'm sorry, excuse me. In the 1990s, researchers Betty Hart and Todd Risley studied families from different socioeconomic levels and found that their children were exposed to vastly different numbers of words in their formative years, specifically 32 million more words for higher income children than for lower income children. The variability in exposure accounted for significant differences in children's language skills when they entered kindergarten, the researchers found, and had a direct impact on how students fared early on in school. The problem of skill differences among children at the time of school entry is bigger and more intractable and more important than we had thought, wrote Hart and Risley. In the quarter century since the landmark study was published, the findings have had a seismic impact on national policies and reform initiatives, which, which include campaigns aimed at closing the 30 million word gap, investments in early childhood education reading programs, and collaborations between the education and health sectors. Um, we got our dear brother Sigma Jones back.
Yes, my apologies. There's a thunderstorm going through, so
Oh no,
I
you're okay.
I temporarily lost connection.
You're okay. You're right. You're okay. So
All right, but yeah, I'm connected now, so I'm getting things
no,
back
no,
up. Yeah.
you're okay. Okay. So you can make this. I mean, this article here. So everything you see on your screen that's highlighted in blue here, that's in the blue writing, those are all clickable links that take you to various articles and studies related to the article that are referenced in the article. So if you want to make it available, you can post it in the chat, whatever brothers want to read it. So, but yeah, let's continue here. But now the study's conclusions are contested by recently published research from psychologist Douglas Sperry and his wife Linda, which found less straightforward connections between the quantity of words children hear and the family's socioeconomic background. Their
And
findings have inspired.
if
Yes, sir.
not to interrupt, but if you mind, if you want to continue, I'm just gonna step away real quick. But
Yeah,
please
no,
continue, sir.
yeah, no, you're fine. Their findings have inspired a growing debate around whether biases around race and class influenced the original study's methodology and distorted the takeaways. Here's something that they're not saying that the general conclusion of the study is incorrect. What they're not saying that the 30 million word gap doesn't exist. What they're saying is that they're looking at the methodology behind the study. And so specifically, they're saying that socioeconomic background have no bearing whatsoever or have little bearing on the quantity of words that children hear. And I actually very much disagree with that. Because socioeconomic status is a reflection of a number of things, but more importantly, it more often than not correlates to higher education. And so higher education oftentimes correlates with higher socioeconomic status. And typically, folks who are beneficiaries of higher education, who have gone to college, maybe gone to grad school, and so on and so forth, more often than not, are far more involved with the upbringing and the education of their children than those who are oftentimes from lower socioeconomic backgrounds.
Mm.
Now, anecdotally, clinicians see this. And truth be told, if you were to find some Black clinicians who are in this arena, who deal with this on a daily basis, I would imagine if you taught them off the record and asked them to be just brutally honest, I would think they would tell you something similar to what I'm saying. That socioeconomic status does have a great bearing on the words you hear, and we're actually going to see this. I'm gonna bring up something. We're gonna have a article from the American Federation of Teachers coming up here in a few moments. That's actually gonna go into that. I'm gonna talk about that. But nonetheless, let's continue. In the last several decades, the original study has shaped the way educators, parents, and policymakers think about educating poor children. But did you know that the number comes from just one study that began almost 40 years ago? with just 42 families, that some people argue it contained a built-in racial bias, wrote Anya Kamenetz, picking up the thread of the argument in a National Public Radio article that went viral. So what does the debate mean for the consensus that was built around children's language development over the past 2 decades? You know, you do anyone that's familiar with statistics and how statistics work. So typically, a good study, if you're looking at a phenomenon that affects a group of people or whatever, typically a good study will have at least 1,000 participants on average.
Right.
But that's the ideal study, at least 1,000 participants. But more often than not, you have studies that have far fewer people. But the issue is that if you consistently see a pattern repeated, even among a lower number, so you can take 100 people, for example, and you can say, well, out of 100 people, we're expecting 50% to exhibit disease A versus the other 50% exhibiting disease B. Now, what you really as you get into the study, you find that no, more like 70% of the people exhibit disease B versus disease A. And then you start to come to a conclusion, well, if I added more people, will that ultimately change the outcome? Will that maybe if I added more people, will that mean more people might get disease A versus B? Or will we continue to see disease B overrepresented in this? And so eventually, once you get to a certain number of people and you start to see the same pattern or trend emerging and staying rather consistent, it becomes obvious. It becomes clear that you can attribute that to a particular group. Now, again, typically you might hear the phrase used, statistics is applicable to a group and not to the individual.
Mm-hmm.
So while statistically this would be applicable to a group, no, it would not necessarily be applicable to the individual family. No, because not every black family is this negligent in the upbringing of their children, if you will. Or I should say criminally. If you ask me, I think this is criminally negligent, but Well, let's look at the methodology. Starting in the early 1990s, a group of researchers led by Hart and Risley tracked 42 Kansas families, 13 wealthy, 10 middle class, 13 low income, and 6 on public assistance from the time their children were 7 to 9 months old until they turned 3 years old.
That makes no sense.
Every month, the researchers visited the families and collected data for an hour on the adult-child interactions they witnessed. Observers recorded the family's spoken interactions and took notes on the context for communication guided by questions such as, did caregivers participate in the children's play? How often did they speak with the children? How often did they encourage or reprimand? So anytime you're designing a study, and I know this because I've been a part of this process on a number of occasions myself, certainly started in undergrad when I was a McNair Scholar. I can tell you that as a McNair Scholar, which was my first foray into academic research and truly the true scientific method, I got a crash course in how to design a study, and specifically when you're looking at designing questionnaires. And when you're looking at designing questions that you want to ask a particular group, for example. So you want to get questions that are neutral. You don't want to get questions that are leading in any way. So, again, because obviously you give leading questions, it skews, it shows, it can certainly bias the study. But the questions that they're going over that were asked, these are pretty neutral questions for the most. They're pretty neutral.
Mm.
I mean, these are basic questions you would ask. You know, do did the caregivers? I mean, you could just replace caregivers with parents. Do parents play with their children? Now, anyone that's knows this, that look, let's just be frank here. Most black children, parents don't play with them. They don't care. That's why they give them iPads and iPhones. Do they speak with the children? Obviously, that's the crux of the. That's really the crux of the study right there. Do they when they do speak with the children? How are they speaking? What are they speaking? What words are they using? What dialect are they using? How often do they encourage or reprimand? Excuse me. After analyzing the resulting 1,300 hours of observation, Hart and Risley determined that an average child in the wealthier families heard more than 2,000 words directed their way that hour of observation, while an average child in a family on public assistance heard closer to 600. By the time the children turned 4 years old, the researchers calculated these differences in spoken language resulted in a gap of around 32 million words. Let me repeat this. Hart and Risley determined that an average child in the wealthier families heard more than 2,000 words directed their way during that hour of observation, while an average child in a family on public assistance heard closer to 600. By the time the children turned 4 years old, the researchers calculated these differences in spoken language resulted in a gap of around 32 million words. And understand this. I don't know. I don't know how many brothers here who've gone to college, and and if you've gone to college, you know you're undergrad, and you've actually had to be for example, for me when I was an undergrad, I did tutoring. So I tutored two different groups. One, because I was a veteran, one of the gentlemen that ran what is known as Veteran Upward Bounds, which is part of that whole TRIO program that's through the federal government. But anyhow, I used to be a tutor for Veteran Upward Bounds, so a lot of veterans that were being had just been released from the service. You know, they want to go to college, use the GI Bill. So many of them would take the entrance exam, and they would be fine on like the English, that part, but the math and the math section, they would kind of be a little iffy. And so I would help them, I would tutor them in the math section and so on. But then I would also tutor. I used to actually help run an ACT, SAT prep program for high school children at a and probably the lowest performing school in Milwaukee, in Milwaukee at the time.
Oh man.
And
Oh, go right ahead, good
and
sir.
well, I don't know if you heard what I was just saying, but I'm talking about essentially how I tutored both veterans and high school students as an undergrad. I was asking if, you know, for a lot of brothers, if they gone to college, how many of them might have been tutors in college and such.
Yeah, I'll raise my hands to that. Especially as a math person.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was
See,
talking about that. This is one of the principal areas where people struggle at colleges, and obviously the math. And so I was talking about essentially how you have a lot of veterans who struggled in math. But the interesting about a lot of veterans is that you can get them up to speed really quick.
that's true.
And I think that a lot of there's a little bit more maturity there. You know, I think they're definitely a bit more dedicated in getting through their studies, obviously because they don't want to waste their GI Bill. But 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 I was talking about how I used to help run an ACT SAT prep program at a high school at the time. I think it was probably the worst performing high school in Milwaukee at the time.
Ooh.
Uh, and And the problems you have there, the problems that I saw just observing the spoken language versus the written language, and how that 32 million word gap isn't just present at 3 years of age, it's present at 6, at 12 years of age when you're entering middle school, it's present at 14 years of age when you're going into high school, and it's present at the collegiate level.
Mm-hmm.
So what I am telling you, once it's there, it is there. There's few people that probably have gotten past that. One of them that comes to mind is probably Malcolm X. And I would argue the only reason it happened for him because he went to prison. Had he not gone to prison, he would have never thought to read through an entire dictionary.
Yes, that's true.
And so that's how he went from Detroit Red to the Malcolm X we know of in history. But that's neither here nor there. But let's continue with this methodology here. So, as an extension of the study, the researchers also continued gathering data on some of the children from the initial study as they got older, finding that the children's early language abilities predicted better language skills in elementary school. So I'm gonna rephrase what this is saying so this becomes crystal clear. In other words, the children who had less words in their vocabulary struggled more in English, reading, and vocabulary, as opposed to the children whose parents spoke 2,000 words or more. So in other words, what this is really saying is that spoken language directly reflects or most likely directly correlates to your ability to perform well academically. Because reading language is just basically the other side of spoken language, is the other side of a written language, yes, or sir, reading a language. And oftentimes what we see this a lot in social media, people write the way they talk. And, oftentimes, my wife, sometimes she'll bring up some things to me and I'm like, I don't understand this. It's like a jumbled mess of syllables and consonants and straight run-on sentences and non-conjugated verbs and all of that stuff. And I'm like, well, what the hell is this? And she's like, oh, well, this means that. I'm like, how the hell am I supposed to understand this? This is like pidgin English.
Right.
But one of the things that they're seeing emerge over time. Now, this is what they observe as they continue to study beyond the initial part of the study. So to make this clear, this is not what they observed initially from just observing the 32 million. This is after they continue to study the folks well beyond the initial part of the study, okay? And they started to see these patterns emerge. So let's just be clear. A later analysis backed those findings up. So if you scroll, I don't know if you got it, if you scroll away, So yeah, where it says later analysis on your screen, if you click on that blue right, it actually takes you to another study that actually talks about that. So if you want to post this article in the chat, if brothers want to go through it and click on some of the other stuff that's highlighted in there, it's probably a good read for those who are interested. Showing that children who have been exposed to more words early in life were more likely to have stronger language comprehension skills in kindergarten and greater vocabulary growth through elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, folks, reading isn't fundamental, talking is.
Yes,
Talking
sir.
to your child is fundamental. Talking to your child in proper English is fundamental.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, but critics of the 30 million word gap warned that the study sample of families was far too small to sustain the movement it spawned. The point to issue the point to issues like the fact that only 29 of the initial 42 families were tracked as their children entered elementary school. In addition, critics like the Sperry's questioned whether they were larger issues there were larger issues of bias and systemic inequities at play that influenced their interpretations. Look,
Wow.
I find this ironic because the Sperry's, I think it was a husband and wife couple, whatever.
Hmm.
Um, here's the thing. I mean, let's just put the cards on the table and just let's not beat around the bush here. I mean, we've all have observed anecdotally in our lives when Black children talk. If you don't believe there's a cognitive deficit, there certainly is a literacy deficit,
Hmm.
or better yet, I should say a failure to properly alliterate the English language. And what becomes, and this is something I've observed in my daily life forever. Okay, this is certainly something I observed being a tutoring, Black high school students and ACT, SAT. You understand? I went into one of the worst performing schools in the city of Milwaukee and was helping teachers, and I did this for free. I wasn't even paid for this. Okay, I wasn't even paid for this. I did this for free. Okay, I did this as a way to give back, just a way to try to help some kids, whatever. The point is, I didn't, I've never made a dollar or anything like that from ever doing it. And I remember I actually had them to write a, I had them to write, just give me a 1-page essay, you know.
Mm.
And what I got was a nightmare. First of all, the vast majority of students didn't understand what 1 page meant. I got a paragraph.
Mm.
Second of all, the paragraphs that I attempted to read through were would were basically jumbled nonsense and run-on sentences. And to be really honest, just straight up Ebonics.
Mm-mm-mm.
And I remember one of the teachers that I think it was one of their English teachers. Um, I said, well, how did you get them to write paragraphs? I mean, have you ever asked them to write paragraphs? Say, yeah, I tried, but it's pulling teeth. And there was a handful of students that actually they understood what a paragraph meant, and they didn't know how to necessarily structure a proper essay, or at least know the basic structure of essay, which is your intro, your body, and your conclusion. So, usually your intro, also known as your thesis, and then you have your body, which is usually, 2 to 3 paragraphs, and then you have your conclusion, which basically you restate your thesis and close it out. You know, the vast majority of students did not understand that basic structure of an essay. And these are things that you learn when you learn basic sentence structure when you're in and kindergarten, first grade, and so on.
Yes, sir.
And these are, I wouldn't even say this is remedial at this point. This was like, if it would be almost saying that, what did you do for the last 16, 17 years of your life?
Right.
And I know people be quick to say that, well, they got things going on at home. Well, then that's also a failure of Black folks.
Right. Doc, the examples you give and everything, I mean, I could come up with examples from my experience being a math tutor. Because one thing that you mentioned that is to me is just so true. Math is something before you can even understand it. You need to have the fundamentals down in regards of basic reading and writing. If you can't have basic reading and writing, you can forget about math. And I will tell this story all the way up until the end of time. When I was tutoring a football player at a university, dude went on to go play in the NFL. I don't know if he's still playing right now, but he athletically he was gifted, I would say. And I never forget, I was helping him with basic algebra. And when I mean basic algebra, I'm talking about solving for X, solving for Y. And there was a particular problem which was very simple of solving for X. And I told him all you have to do is just use order of operations. And I gave him the pencil, and I noticed that he would look at the problem and then he would look out in space. He would look down at the problem and then he would look out in space. And I just asked him, I said, such and such, by chance, do you know how to do order of operations? And I kid you not, the guy looked me dead in the eyes and asked me, well, what is order of operations? And I'm like, my God, you are an 18-year-old man and you don't even know how to do orders of operations.
Let's make something really clear. These are very, you can't have, I've said it many times and I'm going to say it again and I'm going to continue to say, you can't have this systemic level of underachievement and and the people who are affected by it themselves are not a part of the issue.
Right.
This isn't just, quote, a systemic, quote, racism issue. You can't have this level of systemic underachievement and not have the affected population a part of the system that maintains that.
Hmm.
In other words, this, and I've seen this I've seen this throughout my academic career, seen this in undergrad. Numerous people I know who all went to undergrad, many of them were tutors. I know a lot of Black females who used to tutor a lot of these Black athletes, and they didn't have a lot of kind words to say.
Hmm.
And you can't have someone going from cradle to 18 years of age. If he didn't know what order operations was, he certainly probably barely knew how to read.
Right.
Because anyone that's ever, anyone, when you go to college, and especially when you start taking a lot of these standardized exams, a lot of questions, especially in math, aren't just necessarily straight up solve for X or solve for Y, or you solving a system of equations, for examples. No, a lot of times you're giving worded questions.
Hmm.
This is especially true for folks who ever taken general chemistry, you take like physical chemistry, you take physics, you take trigonometry, whatever. You know that oftentimes on exams, and not just exams you take in high school, but just regular exams your teacher or professor might administer. But when you take these standardized exams, a lot of those questions are presented in a passage, in a paragraph, and you have to be able to read the paragraph, understand what it's asking you, pull out the pertinent information, understand the context of the paragraph, and solve the problem. Put the problem together, set it up properly, then solve for whatever you're being asked to solve for. And that is something, if you can't read, you can't even do math.
Mm-mm. No, sir.
If you don't understand the context, you can't do none of that. But no, that is a very good example. Yeah, I know a lot of black folks who have stories like that. But again, they've allowed this boy to get to that because, again, remember what we were talking about earlier. You know, if you're a black male in this country that is illiterate, there's only two things that you can do. Either you can be a part of the prison labor force, or if you're physically talented enough, you might make it to the NCAA. And if you can shut your mouth and not act like a little punk raised by some single hood rat, you might make it to the NBA or the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically the only two things you can do. And the fact that you said that this guy was 18 years of age and he didn't know that, yeah, he got passed through because he was making somebody some money in their sports program.
Yes, sir.
And now he's on the college campus making them more money. And hey, we don't care if you can't read. Hell, we don't care if you can. We don't care if you don't know what y equals mx plus b is. We don't care. Hey, as long as you make us some money, hey, we'll get what we get out of you and let the chips fall where they may.
Right.
And you done seen this movement now for years where these guys want to get paid and all this stuff. And I'm not necessarily against that. No, I'm not. I'm not at all. I am saying that if you have a school to prison pipeline, is it fair enough to say you have a school to maybe professional sports pipeline?
Mm-hmm.
So we know academically you can't really cut it, but hey, maybe you got enough physical chops, physical talents where we can make some money from you that way. So either way
And
it goes, you trade in one institution for another. But go ahead, sir.
but it's interesting, Doc, because I remember kind of towards the beginning of the pandemic, there was a there was a newsreel about the NFL donating up to, I think it was at the time it was like $25 million for relief funds down south and everything. Uh, the states down south and whatnot. And some people they were talking about, oh, it's so great the NFL is helping out these families and everything, and looking out, for those who are not lucky enough and all. And I'm telling us like, yeah, the NFL is doing that because they're trying to make sure their talent pipeline is secure. If this COVID takes out a good portion of these athletes, there goes their talent base.
Yeah. And it's much more difficult to cultivate talent. Even if you were to go, let's say you go overseas, you go, I don't know, some country in Africa, I don't know. It's still far more difficult to cultivate talent overseas as opposed to homegrown talent.
Yes,
When you
sir.
got a never ending supply of bucks coming from these brood mares who can go into these collegiate systems being functionally illiterate, just dysfunctional, period, You know, a good example of that. There's a documentary on a documentary series on Netflix called I can't think of the name of it. Escapes me at this time. I can't remember, but I'm when I think of the name of it, I'll bring it back up. But
Mm.
if you guys have Netflix, you really need to watch it because it perfectly summarizes what we're talking about right now. But yeah, I mean, these things you just can't have this endemic level, this systemic level of academic malfeasance, and and Black folks are somehow not a part of this willful negligence of academics, of just, I mean, even if you don't strive to be the best student ever, can you at least try to be average?
Right.
I, I think a lot of folks might just be okay with that, but we're not even seeing average here. But we gonna go into that too. So yeah, so let's continue here. Um, Imagine you are an African. Okay, hold on. Okay, here we go. So imagine you are an African American mother and you're living in a housing project. Douglas Ferry said in the interview. So here's the psychologist. Him and his wife had the other study that called into question the 30 million word gap. But look at the example he gives here. I want brothers to pay attention to this example he gives. I'm going to repeat it. Imagine you are an African American mother and you're living in a in a housing project. Douglas Ferry said in an interview. When someone comes to videotape you, even though you have the best intentions and they have the best intentions, are you likely to be quiet or to talk a lot?
Huh?
I'm,
What?
yeah.
I mean, that makes no sense. That's a very weak argument.
It's not just a weak argument, but what they really saying is that are Negroes willing to perform for the damn camera?
Well, I mean, yeah, in that regard, look at World Star Hip Hop.
Yeah. Look at TikTok. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a never-ending supply of videos and little shorts and clips on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok every single day. You put a camera in front of Black children, let's see how well they can perform. This idea where every time someone puts a damn camera or puts some type of recording device in front of you, you just got to perform. This goes back to slavery here. Black folks been doing this jigabooning crap since slavery, where everything is always a performance. It's time to show out. And it's interesting that a white male who's an academic would make a statement like that. Because inherently what it shows is that he knows the population of people he's studying.
Ooh, that's a good point. Very good point.
And this idea that Negroes like to pretend like, oh, they don't know us, oh, they know you very well. They wouldn't be able to put out these kinds of studies if they didn't know you. And I know this firsthand. I've seen it firsthand. Oh, they understand. They understand Black folks very well. But the simple fact that he mentioned an African American mother living in a housing project, that all Black folks grew up in a housing project? Because I didn't grow up in a housing project. I would imagine the brothers in this chat, you, Sigma Jones, didn't grow up in a housing project neither.
Nope, no sir.
So the idea is that he is talking about a very specific group of Black folks, a very specific population. And because we know that de facto housing arrangement in Black America is single mother and children. And so, again, he knew his target population. They knew their target population. Now they say, now Mr. Sperry and his wife argue that there were some biases, but I will argue just in the very statement alone shows some inherent bias on their side. But let's continue. Critics like Sperry and others also argue that the study favors white upper and middle class speech norms and focuses exclusively on conversations between parent and child that do not account for cultural differences and how families interact and communicate. We should acknowledge upfront that there are political differences and power differences between the language dialects that are spoken, said Sperry, who says that word gap studies cultural biases undervalue speech activities in diverse families. Okay, here's the layman's term of this rigmarole of this rhetorical run-on here. We know you Negroes speak Ebonics, and we account for that.
Essentially, Doc, what I'm getting from this, that paragraph, they're essentially saying, look, if you Negroes actually started to speak properly, you actually would not be in the situation you're in right now. If you really look deep into what this guy Spurry is trying to say is, yes, and even though he's trying to be a critic, he's actually acknowledging that yes, there actually is a difference between how normal Americans speak, i.e., like white and Asians and Hispanics and Latinos, all those normal Americans, and then there's Black Americans. Even though there are Black Americans who are just as normal regular Americans, but Black Americans, there's a different language that they speak.
So now remember, this article leads in by talking about that this was one of the main researchers. Him and his wife were two of the main researchers who were disagreeing and was saying that there was a lot of racial and cultural bias in the study. But on the other hand, they have this statement from the guy, from Mr. Sperry, and he's essentially acknowledging what the study found.
Right.
And what did I say earlier? He knows. They're not saying that the word gap isn't real. They're asking you to ignore it in favor of these reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But go ahead, sir.
Oh no, I was just highlighting Isaac Salmon's comment. It was really a backhand comment on the Negroes, and they didn't pick up on it because, like you said, he acknowledged that it exists, but in a way, he's saying we shouldn't pay attention to it because highlighting it is biased and racial in and of itself.
Exactly.
Wow.
Crazy, isn't it?
Wow. Yeah.
Absolutely insane. Now, here we go. For instance, while children appear to benefit from direct interactions with their parent or caregiver, there may be other linguistic skills to be gained from participating in different kinds of speech. To that end, in their recent study, the Sperrys tried to capture a wider language context for the young children in their study by measuring bystander speech or conversations within children's earshot that weren't directed at them. Or in other words, eavesdropping.
Mm,
Even the idea is contested turf, though. University of Delaware education professor and psychologist Roberta Golenkopf, lead author of a viral article defending the 30 million word gap in wake of the publication of the Sperry study, argues against including overheard speech in word gap calculations. Young children are not capable of picking up that much from overheard speech, says Golenkopf, who has written a number of books, including bestseller on children's language development. You have to know more language to be able to do that. And I would agree with that.
right. I mean, even if you come from a home where, say, you have two languages, English and then another language at all, that child is only going to know those two languages. There's absolutely no way a child's going to eavesdrop in a different environment and somehow miraculously know what a third language is all about.
I agree. I agree. Now, if you're going to take in consideration, yeah, you might want to take in consideration from children who coming from bilingual or maybe even trilingual homes. Now, that's a consideration to take into to account.
Right.
But if we're assuming that the children are all coming from English speaking homes, no. Conversations that are within an earshot of them, no, they wouldn't understand it, and they certainly wouldn't understand the context of it. But this is kind of my thing. So you have one group of researchers who are saying, well, it exists. Then you have for example, the Sperry's, they say, well, there's racial bias, but then you kind of give this real backhanded, I wouldn't even call it a compliment, but really a backhanded statement as to why XYZ exist. But let's continue. But critics of the original study and the movement that built around its framing generally agree that adults can boost the development of children in their care by speaking with them, and the bulk of research agrees. Let me reread this for you brothers again. But critics of the original study and the movement that built around its framing generally agree that adults can boost the development of children in their care by speaking with them, and the bulk of research agrees. In other words, the findings of the study holds true. So so the critics agree that, well, we didn't like the context of the study, but the findings may not necessarily, but the findings are not necessarily not true. But we just didn't like the context.
Right. Because usually, if and Doc, being that we're both from the scientific world, usually if there's a disagreement in regards of findings in a research, the proper thing to do is to go and develop your own study and own research to come up with new analysis and evidence that disproves the main study. And from what I can gather from here, they're not able to do that, which shows that, yeah, they just didn't agree with how the information is presented, but behind closed doors, they have no argument regardless of, yeah, this is actually true.
Yeah. And they also argue that one of the interventions that help prevent the gap is just by parents talking with their children.
Mhm.
Everyday language builds your child's vocabulary and helps them with their phonology, their morphology, their syntax. So no one disagrees with that. And the research backs it up. And I agree, Rael. Language is an art. That's why writing is an art. That's why if you anyone who ever, anyone who's ever whoever does done research or PhD, whatever, your grad student, even undergrads who do research, the reason there's so much emphasis. Anyone that's ever applied to grad school know that most grad schools ask you for a sample of your writing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Especially for programs that are feeders into PhD, especially for like graduate programs, master's programs that are feeders into PhD programs. They oftentimes ask you for a sample of your writing. Why? Because they need to know you understand the basics of research and academic writing
Mm-hmm.
and how to properly form. How do you take data that you've accumulated from your research and how do you incorporate it into an academic argument? And so, yes, that in of itself is not just really a science. It is an art. Being able to write and being clear, concise, coherent. These are all. It is an art. It truly is.
Right.
And so, no, that's an excellent observation, Rado. Well, let's continue, sir. All right. A 2017 study collected speech data on 329 families using automated recorders tucked into children's clothing and found some gaps in children's early language experiences that were similar but not identical to the original 30 million word gap. Meanwhile, a 2018 study led by researchers at Harvard and Massachusetts Institute of Technology used MRI technology to track how children's brains reacted while they listened to stories. They found that young children who had more frequent conversations with their caregivers had different neurological patterns than peers who didn't. I
Uh-oh.
actually read this study, and I did read this study. If you click on that where it says the 2018 study by, it actually takes you to the study, and I read through it, and I looked at some of the MRI images, and it was a pretty compelling study. So what this is ultimately saying, gentlemen, is that your brain works a bit differently when you actually have relevant conversations with your family, with your parents, and every other word is an N word this or N word that,
Or the B
or
word this or B word that.
yeah, or shout out to MOT Bravo Alpha November this and Bravo Alpha November that. So so yeah. So in other words, folks, reading is fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
Research likewise shows that these early language development skills are important for children's longer term academic success. A 2007 study that gaps in children's language abilities in kindergarten account for the majority, I repeat, the majority of the academic achievement gap, of the achievement gap between children from families of high and low socioeconomic status. And there has also been significant research linking early interventions like quality home visiting programs, childcare, and pre-K with improved early language metrics and better long-term outcomes for children. I want to say something really quickly on that. Do you realize in many states, in many cities, there are numerous programs that are completely free of charge
Mm-hmm.
to new mothers? And I know this because I have, when I was an undergrad, I had to do clinical rotations and I did some of these home visits. These are 100% free, usually provided by the Department of Health or some other agency within those cities. But these are completely free for new or and expecting mothers.
Hmm.
So there are lots of programs out there that are actually designed specifically to provide some form of intervention. Now, whether or not people utilize them, that's another story. Yet Sperry and others emphasize that research on language gaps in the early years can miss more fundamental takeaways about the deeper racial and economic inequities affecting child's life and poverty, referencing a body of research building since the 1960s that shows that a family's socioeconomic status and parental education levels heavily shape children's learning.
Uh-oh. And you know something, Doc? Because our first culture bomb, we did a study that showed that the the IQ of a child, as far as their levels, is actually based on the mother more so than the father.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. So if you were to take this and just put it in layman's terms, essentially it means that more educated parents have better performing children academically.
Hmm.
Just plain and simple. I mean, look, I've always, since we started doing these culture bombs, I've always been very clear behind the scenes, and even while we do these culture bombs, that my angle has always been, I think every black man needs to have at a minimum a bachelor's degree. And it's not just because, quote, you're trying to do something that society expects of you. No, it's because there are things that you learn being a college student that you just don't learn jumping straight into the workforce. And there's a socialization that goes on college campuses, in collegiate environments, in these academic environments that just simply don't happen. I've listened to a number of uh, Sigma. I listened to you and Kitagakide, Jones talk about, family, and certainly listen to Kitagakide talk about, his family and, how he met his wife and how those relationships he had in college were really the things that set him up for where he's at now. And
Right.
specifically when it comes to his family and his children and such like that. And I will argue the same is true of me. I met my wife in undergrad. Truth be told, um, these kinds of issues are issues that my wife deals with on a regular. And she oftentimes deals with kids. She deals with a lot of kids who have congenital issues. I typically deal in the adult arena, so I'm not really a child person, but I understand after dealing with adults that much of where they're at in their adult life has been directly influenced by what happened to them in those formative years.
Hmm.
So just food for thought, gentlemen. Indeed, researchers who defend Hart and Risley often agree and generally urge policymakers to do more. Well, yeah, we don't need to talk about that. I think you gentlemen got the bulk of what needed to be talked about in this article here. Now, there's a couple more articles, but there's one that we definitely have to get to, and then we'll call it a night here. And that one is the AFT article. Let's see. Um, yeah, if you can open the AFT article, because this one I think really is going to hit home and really summarize what we talked about tonight.
All right. AFT coming up. And here we go.
I think Mr. Evil Wabbit got it wrong. Military is not a jobs program, or do I need to revisit that legendary stream we did a year ago that pissed a lot of folks off about the military?
Well, I mean, we could definitely circle back on the military later, but I know, Doc, tomorrow, me, you, and Shinobi Bro, we definitely got some stats that
I
definitely,
could put up this article that kind of, you know what? Yeah, you got some stats. We'll probably go over it tomorrow. So I hope the
yeah.
gentleman listens in. So let's get to this one here because I think this one is really the crux of the issue. So reading depends on the spoken language. So reading and writing are dance partners. They go hand in hand. One does not exist without the other. And you cannot master one without mastering the other. So let's start off here. Reading depends on spoken language. This is a simple statement with profound consequences for children whose spoken language differs from the language they are expected to read. For most children, the language skills they bring to school will support learning to read, which is mainly learning to understand their spoken language in a new form, print. However, some children's language skills differ in important ways from the classroom language variety, and teachers rarely receive sound guidance on how to enhance their literacy instruction to meet these children's needs. So, this article is called Teaching Reading to African American Children, and it comes from the American Federation of Teachers. So, if you don't know, this is one of the largest teachers' unions in the country. Teaching reading to children whose language differs from the oral language of the classroom and from the linguistic structure of academic text adds an additional layer of complexity to reading instruction. There is a large and growing body of evidence indicating that language variation impacts reading, spelling, and writing in predictable ways. In particular, it has been demonstrated that mixed matches between the language variety spoken by many African American children in their homes and communities and written language variety encountered in books and other texts can slow the development of reading and writing. The focus of this article is the impact of one language variety, African American English, AAE, on the literacy development and on teaching, assessment, and learning. Our goal is to describe aspects of instruction, curriculum, and assessment that may create obstacles to literacy for African American children, compounding the effects of other factors such as growing up in systematically under-resourced neighborhoods, and to share ways to modify instructional practices to benefit AAE speakers in significant way. So essentially what AAE is African American English, or also colloquially known as Ebonics, versus GAE, General American English, also known as the Common Language. So essentially, what this article is getting at is discussing the difficulties that children have who grow up in households where they speak Ebonics and how that translates to poor academic performance in the classroom.
Not surprised, not surprised.
So let's continue.
I
May
mean,
go ahead.
you can go to any black junior high junior high school and everything, and students who are in the eighth grade, black students, have a reading level as of right now no better than a fourth grader or below. So that should tell you right there. Reading skills, comprehension skills is definitely not on par with that demographic.
I'm not sure who this gentleman is, but I don't know about the bombastic comments, but I'll just make this really simple. You clearly weren't paying attention to the previous article. It's not like we haven't discussed these issues before on on the culture bomb or even in some of the segments that Sigmund Jones has done with Kidagakide Jones. And we've all known that these issues exist. This isn't some communist conspiracy. These are just relevant facts. The previous article talked about research on these subjects that have been going back to since have been going back since the days of Jim Crow. Because let's be really clear about what African American English is. African American English is basically a carryover to slave dialect.
Mm.
Where black folks should have left the slave dialect, where black folks should have left the slave dialect on the plantations, they did it. And this has become so ingrained into the culture that you see it permeates all throughout popular culture in America. You see the way people write on Twitter. You see the way people write when they, put up a Facebook post, an IG post, whatever. It's such an ingrained part of the culture. It's part of American society in of itself. And I think that's the part that's this gentleman is not getting here. Now you're just trolling. Okay, let's continue. Many African American children are bi-dialectal speakers of English. That is, they speak two varieties of English, African American English and General American English. Whereas AAE is frequently spoken in the child's home and community, GAE is used in reading, writing, educational contexts, commerce, and the media. One of the major educational linguistics tasks for school-age African American children who speak AAE is to bridge the two varieties in order to develop strong literacy skills. Importantly, for many African American children, particularly those growing up in communities enduring chronic poverty, though GAE may be encountered through media such as television, it becomes prominent upon entry into school. GAE is the medium of instruction, and in school, it is learned through exposure and modeling in the classroom. Also important, not every African American child speaks AAE, although most do. What do you think of that?
Well, that's true. I mean, I look at us, and I didn't learn Ebonics. You didn't learn Ebonics. A lot of the gentlemen that we bring up on the series and all, they haven't learned Ebonics. So it is true that not every, you know, Black American child speaks Ebonics, but the vast majority do. And reason why we know that is when you have the stats that show that at this moment in time, 80% of black children are being born and raised in single parent households, i.e., single mother households. Who you think is teaching them these ebonics?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of an enculturalization process, or if you will, a socialization process.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, what this article is really arguing, if you will, is that there needs to be exceptions made for how to teach it in classroom. We've heard I'm sure most people have heard the phrase code switching, where you put on your professional academic voice, and then when you're in the presence of black folks, you do the Negro way. And essentially, that's what that's one of the points that this article is making,
All right.
is how to best incorporate. But let's continue here because it actually brings us some very interesting descriptions of AE and how it applies to Black children, and essentially how Black children essentially have not benefited from it. But let's continue. The history of AAE has been fraught with social, educational, and political judgments about AAE's legitimacy and value. AAE is a systemic, ruled governed variety of American English spoken by a community of speakers connected by race, culture, identity, and culture. Excuse me, and language, sorry. That fits the linguistic definition of a dialect, but the term is problematic for other reasons. AE has been referred to as bad English, poor grammar, and ghetto by people outside of its community of speakers. As a result, attempts to introduce AAE into classrooms or to leverage it to teach children who speak it how to read have been met with great resistance. Unfortunately, these negative views of AAE sometimes become conflated with the children who speak it, and expectations for them are lowered. It is important that teachers understand language varieties that are linguistically equal, even when they are not socially. The social stigma surrounding varieties spoken by linguistic minorities can be compounded by race and class, but they are as linguistically valid as other dialects and highly valued by the people who speak them. So it's making an argument for ebonics. It's essentially telling you there's nothing wrong with it. So I am on the side to say that there is something inherently wrong with it.
Right.
Look, if people know nothing about you, how is it? So if you meet someone, they know nothing about you, the first impression they get is when you open your mouth. And before you open your mouth is how you look. How do you present yourself? Do you present yourself as a clean, well-kept person? Or do you present yourself as someone who's wearing clothes, maybe a little too big, not properly fitting, you know, kind of just hastily thrown on? And then once you get past the actual looks, then it comes to when you open your mouth. And for a lot of people, the moment you open your mouth, it lets them know, right? It lets them know immediately whether or not you're someone they're going to associate with or not.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And people say, oh, well, there's bias. Everyone has a bias to an extent. I don't talk to people. I do have an issue with a bias. I think it needs to be, it is remnants of Negroes, the way Negro, it is remnant of slave talk. It is definitely a remnant of that. Of the language, of the broken languages that slaves spoke. And it needs to be it needs to be done away with. And so yes, people make assumptions about you based on one, the way you talk. Oftentimes you hear this all the time. You know, a lot of people from the north, they come south like me, and you go into some of these southern states and you hear these folks talking like, damn, there's some serious literacy issues going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, people make conclusions. I could bring up we might have to tackle this at some point, showing that there's actually a correlation between folks who do blue collar work and language and reading skills versus those who are college educated
Hmm.
and do more white collar work. I could bring that up. That's something I might tackle. Something we might have to tackle. I haven't decided on that one yet. But yeah, but this is important because we've all heard it. And it's very difficult to not make a conclusion, to not draw an opinion of someone who speaks in that manner. It is very difficult to not be biased. And that's just the honest truth. When a
Yeah.
child who is learning, I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
Oh no, I was moving
Yeah.
moving down.
When a child who is learning English as their second or third language lags behind in reading English, we recognize that the learning curve is steep because the child is learning to both speak and read a second language. So, in other words, people who are bilingual or trilingual, they have to now, they have to learn not only to speak a language, but to read it and write it. And anyone that's familiar with, speaking, if you speak more than one language, know that English tends to be one of the hardest, one of the most difficult languages to learn because the syntax of it is completely reversed.
Hmm.
Where most languages, you would see verbs and coming before nouns is reversed in English.
Yep. I can vouch for that because Japanese, especially right now, I'm brushing up on my own lessons on the back end. One of the key things when it comes down to speaking the language is verbs come first before the noun or the subject.
Yeah, and I I took Spanish in high school, took it in college, and even before then, I had learned to speak a bit of French and Arabic because my time spending time over in Europe and picked up a little bit of some other languages too. But for the most part, I spent quite a bit of time in France and in Morocco specifically. Uh, yeah, picked up a lot of French and Arabic, and French. If you learn to speak, if you know how to speak a little bit of Spanish, it's pretty much the same. They're all part of the same family of languages, so not terribly difficult to pick up on if you have some experience speaking like Spanish or Italian or something like that. But Arabic was a little bit. Um, Arabic was probably a bit more difficult because one, Arabic is read right to left, but not left to right, um, and is also written as such.
Hmm.
But yeah, but I say that because you can account for children's s- struggling in in English if they come from a bilingual or trilingual or if more languages are spoken in the home or more. You can account for that. And what I'm saying is that the only difference is because Ebonics or African American English is such a broken dialect. It's like if you went to the Caribbean, you went to Jamaica and they speak pidgin English. Anyone that's ever been to Jamaica, I've been there. It's, they speak English. It's really kind of hard to understand it sometimes.
Hmm.
And a lot of those are vestiges. Those languages are vestiges, are remnants of colonial. colonial times and being slaves. And so because people were generally illiterate in those days, they cobbled together whatever languages, whatever words that they can learn, and they turned it into a language. And it became, you hear the pidgin language, pidgin English if you're in like the Caribbean nations, or if you in you if you ever anyone that's ever been in London. I lived in London for a little bit too, and I can tell you, you go to like uh like Rotterdam, and you go to some places where black a lot of the immigrants are at. The English that's spoken there is almost unintelligible,
Mm.
and certainly if you see that. Well, let me back up here. The point is simply that you have you have languages that black folks in many places speak. If they speak English, some form, they do speak some dialect of it, and a lot of it is slang. And that's just by nature of how you learn how historically those folks learned the language, and the language was passed down through the generations.
Mm.
So yeah, let's continue here.
Here we go.
By far the most studied variety in American English, AAE's characteristics in the five primary domains of language: morphology, phonology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, have been well documented in adults and are becoming better documented in children. These investigations have demonstrated that, as used by young children, AAE primarily involves variation in verb morphology, syntax, and phonology. And this orange chart here you see kind of breaks it down. These are the three main characteristics of African American English, if you will. And so the
This,
first being
I was
was
going
that
to say, I'm looking at the examples,
yeah,
um, like the cow, jump,
yeah,
jump over the moon. It should be jumped. And then you say he fixed the broken car, should be fixed.
yeah,
Says she saw three cat in the window, should be cats. A girl putting some glass on the table to drink, should be glasses. My friend want to buy some, should be wants. Candy when we get to the store. I rode in my uncle car, should be uncles with apostrophe. They
mhm.
waiting for their car.
And you know why? Remember what we were talking about earlier, where people literally write the way they speak, and this is
Mm-hmm.
why this is so pertinent. Because if you walked into a collegiate environment and you wrote an essay and you wrote the way these sentences, they would a professor probably would question your fundamental intelligence. Like these things, these issues, if you will. And they give you some context where they talked about verb morphology. So we know that adding ed or s on the end of a word can turn into a verb, and how that gets in many ways distorted in African American English. Now, if you go down to where it says syntax, which is one of my pet peeves, subject verb agreement.
Yeah. My friends was running fast to catch the bus.
Yeah, yeah.
this blank my red card. This my red card. They blank watching the girls jump rope. They watching the girls jump rope.
Now, the one below it right here, phonology, this is probably the big one. I would argue. I would argue this one is, I think many folks would probably agree, this one probably the most distinct characteristic of AAE.
Hmm.
So you got consonant cluster reduction, and I always joke when my wife talking about, yeah, Negroes always deleting consonants from words.
Right. Like it's cold. Uh, I'm out in the field.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's cast. It's like what?
Yeah, yeah. I always joke my wife about Negroes just deleting whole consonants from words. Now the second one, drop the G. We know this one is common. This one is very common. So you got jump in instead of jumping, wait 10 instead of waiting, go in instead of going.
Yep.
And then you have invocalis and post vocalic. And basically all that means is essentially what's going on here is that um, you basically people are replacing the what would be essentially a th sound with a t sound. So if you look at it like here, so it says instead of it should be they people say with with an F instead of with.
I'm
So you
with.
know, yeah,
I'm with the people.
yeah, I'm with,
Or
or instead of with, and then you see sometimes people might say a T with instead of with, and then you say bay instead of bathe.
it's interesting. And then the pro vocalic positions.
Yeah,
This,
again,
but they say this. And then them, them,
yeah,
that.
that's a
Yeah.
common one you see. Damn,
Mm-hmm.
oh damn instead of them, and then you have that versus that. And something interesting. My wife and I were talking about this earlier. She reminded me of the New Orleans Saints. Their theme. Who that? That's what they say.
Hmm. Or even like the Cincinnati Bengals, they have one. Who they?
Yeah,
D
who
E
they?
D E Y.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Who they?
Who they? Who they? That is what they say. Who that? So yeah, they have consonant cluster movement. So basically, this one is basically you have one consonant replaced with another. So instead of ask, they say X. So instead of escape, they say escape. So they switch the in
They
this
switched
case
the S.
and
So
the K.
yeah,
They
yeah.
switch the S to the K sound. So yeah, this
Wow.
this, this one is interesting, very interesting.
And it's
Now, this second part really relates to what we talked about before in the previous article. Um, I don't think there's really much to go over except, um, well, I did want to read this middle paragraph right here. So it
mm,
says one key issue is the amount of dialect present in a child's language, which is referred to as dialect density. Dialect occurs on a continuum from low to high use. For example, children for whom dialect influences less than 10% of their oral language are said to have a low dialect density. Those whom dialect influences 50% or more of their oral language have high dialect density. Differences in density impact reading and writing in important ways. The higher the dialect density, the further the child's speech is from the language used in reading and writing. Simply put, linguistic distance influences how much instruction and practice a child is likely to need to bridge the differences between oral language at home, oral language spoken by the teacher, and the written language of books and texts. And you know what else I would add to that? Standardized testing.
Mm,
The more AAE that a child uses, the more likely that reading, writing, and spelling growth may be slowed, contributing to the reading struggles of African American children in later elementary school and adolescence. Challenges in learning to read are not inevitable for children who speak AAE, but great attention to the impact of their language on reading and writing development is critical. I actually disagree with that last statement. I would say it is it is inevitable that they will struggle with
right.
reading because you cannot bridge the gap between the language that you speak versus the common language or the general formal language that's written in books. And this is
See,
certainly true when you think about standardized testing. Go ahead, sir.
but it's interesting, Doc, because they're trying to make it seem like Ebonics is is somehow a legit language. So if you can learn, say, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, Germanic, and all those, then it should be easy to learn Ebonics. What they don't understand is there is a cognitive dissonance with Ebonics because, like you just said, you can't translate something from Ebonics to mean the accurate information in the common English language. Like it's easy to make interpretations between American English and proper English, like the Queen's English and all, because you know is very similar. It's very the bases are the same. You don't have that with Ebonics.
Yeah. No, I absolutely concur. So the fundamental issue is here is that for years we've heard stories about, you've seen articles talking about, you've seen studies that say that yes, we need to do away with the SAT or the ACT, but yet it's never really put into context because the context of it is that if the average Black child is growing up in a household where they're speaking AAE, naturally they're going to struggle in their literacy skills. That is a that is almost an inevitable conclusion. There are some children who can. There are some children who may not struggle, but those are a small percentage. And I would argue, usually for those children, AAE is usually introduced as part of their external environment and not their internal environment, i.e., their home environment. So, in other words, when they get out, when they're out in the world and they're in school, they get introduced to it through their peers, or they're introduced to it through popular culture, through music. But internally in their home, when they're speaking with their parents, when they're having conversations with their parents, when their parents are explaining to them a lot of those idiosyncrasies of the world and the nature of how the world works, that language is the GAE versus what we see with children who, for those, for the vast majority of Black children, who more often than not are growing up in homes where AAE is the common dialect. For example, I'll give you an example. In a lot of countries, especially countries where it's common to see more than one language spoken. So, for example, in Morocco, I talked about Morocco earlier. In Morocco, Arabic is the common language, but the language that educated people speak, those who go to college, those who come from more affluent households, tend to speak more French than Arabic.
Hmm.
You even see this a lot in many African countries. Well, Morocco is an African country, but other African countries as well, where you will see a lot of countries, they might have that indigenous language, which tends to more or less be the common language. But then for more educated folks, or for some folks where the, I guess you could say, the colonial language has replaced the common language, or it has become the common language in many respects. So, I mean, you do see that.
It is
But in
interesting.
general, goes that?
Oh, I was gonna say Isasama brings up something interesting. How there's also different regional differences in Ebonics as well. You need subtitles and translator to understand any part of it.
You
And
know
it's some.
that is very true. Go ahead, son. Go
I,
ahead.
I was gonna say because the Ebonics that say some of my relatives talk in the, you could say, the southern part of Texas is way different compared to the Ebonics that some relatives I have in Alabama talks. Like it's
Yeah,
unique.
yeah,
It's
no,
like those states down south has a unique way of how they go about their Ebonics.
yeah, no. I 100% agree with Isaac's statement and what you're saying as well, because you know, you know, in my travels, especially going south, I grew up in the Midwest, and so when obviously it's spoken everywhere. Ebonics is spoken everywhere, but I would say when you go to these southern states, it is a very special dialect that gets spoken, unlike anything I've ever heard. And not only is this really special dialect, if you will, but yeah, it is oftentimes it's very difficult to understand it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think Google Translate doesn't even account for that. So yeah, so it's just one of these. It's certainly one of these issues where we're seeing that. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, because we know that we covered this many times before, talked about testing, standardized testing, and for years, Black folks have complained that, oh, well, standardized testing is racially biased, and I would argue it's not even racially biased. It just really uses general American English, if you will, and Black folks don't use the rank and file Black household does not speak that, and so it becomes an issue of lost in translation.
Hmm.
Let's see here. So let's go down to non-language factors. Um, yeah, let's go. Yeah, sorry. In addition to the differences between AAE and GAE, other factors contribute to the difficulty many African American children experience with academic achievement in general and reading in particular. Some factors are related to the child's immediate environment, such as socioeconomic status and family factors. Other factors are related to broader social, economic, and political context, especially educational opportunity and quality, housing security, access to adequate nutrition and healthcare. Of these, socioeconomic status has received the most attention. The impact of reading difficulties on many aspects of emotional health and well being have also been examined, albeit to a lesser extent. So let's read this section right here on socioeconomic status.
Mm.
Income inequality and educational equality have been linked historically. Recent analysis suggests that disparities in students' academic achievement by race and socioeconomic status have remained virtually unchanged for the past half century. In the United States, income, wealth, and access to higher education are unequally distributed. Although policymakers, researchers, and others have long talked about achievement gaps, differences in academic performance between high and low SES students are more accurately referred to as opportunity gaps. For students in lower SES backgrounds, their achievement often does not represent their potential to learn, but does reflect the inequality and opportunity to learn resulting from lower quality and less abundant educational, social, and material resources that often plague children in both urban and rural environments. The opportunity gap has been calculated as a 1.0 standard deviation disparity in achievement between the highest and lowest ends of the distribution, lowest SES ends of the distribution. This difference represents a disparity of approximately 4 years worth of learning in both math and reading, and it persists through high school. Notably, among AAE speakers, nearly 100% of high density dialect users are from low income families and communities. Thus, high density of dialect seems to reflect the social isolation characteristic of neighborhood poverty that limits experience and exposure to GAE in the classroom. This frequently translates into poor reading performance. So remember, a high density dialect is basically those who speak more than 50% or more of their dialect consist of AAE. That's high density, if you remember that from what we read earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So what this is saying is that there's a correlation between the more AE that's incorporated into your language, the higher the likelihood that you struggle in reading. You have any other questions on this? Yeah, I mean, excuse me. Have any comments on this?
No, to me, it's pretty accurate.
Okay.
Um, Plus, I mean, there's again, you being a former college tutor, myself being a former college tutor, the evidence is there. I don't know why they want to try to make it seem like, um, so to speak, that there's no link between social economics and um, you know, far as intelligence, but really there is. Um, Even to the mere fact that if your mother did not have a good IQ, there's a very high probability you may not have that as well.
And, and I think there have been a number of arguments that have been made that more often than not, socioeconomic status is directly tied to education levels. So, in other words, generally speaking, the more educated one tends to be, the more they tend to make. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. There's always exceptions to everything. However, generally, it holds true. Now, they did mention something down at the bottom here because this section is pretty much the last. Is that we go be we'll be done with that. But I did want to bring up a graph. We don't need to read that rest. The rest of this, I mean, you can post this up if you like, or if you want to share with like I don't know SKC or Kid Jones. I think it's a good read. Something they might actually something I could definitely see SKC talking about something like this.
I was gonna say this actually go in line with SKC because he has done streams where they talk about decoding ebonics. So this actually will
Coding
go right in
Ebonics.
line. Yeah, there was a I forgot there was a clip he did where he found this video of of a white guy, and he actually breaks down as far as how to interpret different forms of ebonics. It was hilarious, but it was also pretty interesting.
I that'd be interesting to hear. Oh, I probably would be very interested in hearing that one. That's interesting. You know, now this last paragraph we read that we'll be done with this article here. Not that. I'm sorry. Go back. If you go back up to the previous paragraph I just read on the emotional health and well being, go to that last paragraph in that section. Yeah,
Okay.
well, yeah. Yeah, assuming different personas in different contexts, in this case, school and home, creates the double consciousness described by sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. Monitoring the presentation of self, which includes language, carries cognitive and emotional costs. Cognitively speaking, it is an additional task to be performed while engaged in other activities such as reading. Emotionally, it involves continuous self evaluation, criticism, and correction. Research on this topic is almost non existent, but it is part of the bidialectal experience that needs close attention. Basically, this is the code switching. This is essentially what this last paragraph is getting to. It's the concept of code switching. Black folks talk, you know, when you're around professionals or you're in an academic environment, you talk in a very academic professional manner. Then when you get around black folks, you talk in the lay manner. And in this case,
Hmm.
the lay manner is ebonics. So that's essentially what this paragraph is talking about. Yeah, I think we're done with this. We're done with this article. I did want to bring up a, ch- a chart here, but I'll tell you what. We're actually going to hold off on that. I think we should just end it here because there's a few other things I want to get into, and yeah, we gonna hold off on this one for now. But I think we got the point across here for tonight.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say, especially with the first two articles you presented, good sir, and it actually this actually helps correlate into tomorrow's stream, the Black Ronan's Intel, where
Mm-hmm.
I'll be bringing up an article about from the man's perspective how not being able to read or write has significant consequences in how much money you're able to make here in America. And Kitagakure, he got some articles that looks at the economics in regards of, hey, if you're not able to get in the game and actually um, utilize what everybody else is, trying to do and all, there's some dire consequences. And this can all be traced back to this, where it says that essentially if you can't read and write, you're doomed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. Really quickly, I don't know who this gentleman is. First time I've seen him. I'm not sure what he means by this comment, but three forms of English is the last comment in the chat here.
Okay.
Um,
He says, Sir, I speak technically three forms of English: Jamaican, American, and Adolf. The main problem I had with English was spelling because it wasn't the same as I said it.
Well, that's obvious from the statement.
Right. And I mean, no offense, but you just proved the point right there.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty obvious from the statement. I and again, this is kind of the problem. I mean, I ain't gonna say kind of. This is the problem. And I the reason I wanted to talk about these particular issues tonight is because I know for the longest time there have been a lot of academics, and I'm not academic. Again, I'm a clinician, but I'm not an academic. I'm not in the halls of academia regularly to do this kind of work. But I will say this much: for the longest time, you've had Black academics who've tried to really justify and and really pathologize this backwards dysfunctional language. Even some of your biggest pro blacks out here, they talk about it too. One in particular comes to mind who talks about black folks talks about compares his mastery quote of the English language, his mastery of the English language versus a lot of the folks who call up on his program. And so black folks know that Ebonics is really an issue. And it's an issue that hinders Black children and adolescents, and even many college students academically. And the problem is that so many Black academics have tried to put a good face on this. They try to figure out ways to they try to really intellectualize why is it spoken, how it can be used, and there's really no way to use it because the fundamental issue is that when you walk into a classroom, or even worse, when you're taking an when you're taking a standardized exam like the SAT or the ACT, you're presented you're presented with English. You're presented with General American English, or some people might even refer loosely as the King's English. But nonetheless, that's what you're presented with because that is the language that is spoken. And all these other dialects, yeah, they're regional. You can find some rednecks in any place in this country, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Wisconsin, wherever, Appalachia, that they speak broken English and they speak English just as badly as anything you would see in Ebonics. Certainly that is true. But as it affects Black folks, what's was really the issue here is that there's never really been a movement to truly obliterate it, to get rid of it.
Mm.
In fact, if anything, the opposite has been true. There's been movements in many ways led by a lot of your academics to incorporate it as part of the culture. Hence, the Black code, or in other words, the culture bomb. This is inevitably a part of the culture. And so ultimately, what I'm saying is that we know that children who speak the language as a majority struggle with basic reading, literacy, vocabulary skills, and writing skills. By definition, you're saying that struggle is also part of the culture.
Yeah.
And I guess a better way to say it would be, I think it's colloquially referred to as get it out the mud. that struggle that makes you a real whatever adjective you want to attach to that or noun. So
Mm.
again, this is just one of these. This is one of these deals. I think I said all I think I needed to say here. Um, I do I do want to do a part four to this
All
because
right.
I yeah I do want to do a part four to this. So and yeah, because it is there's been things that I've looked at that I've noticed, and in part four we're gonna look at probably some things that have been going on in popular culture in Black America. Specifically, what we talked about in the opening about things going on with entertainers and their sons, and why it is so important as Black men. You better choose the vestiges who bear your seed well. Because if you put it into a poison wound, you end up with you end up with kids talking bad about you after you spared them your upbringing.
Mm.
You end
No
up
doubt.
having your children publicly talk bad about you, speaking to you as if somehow you're their peer, or excuse me, they are your peer when they're not your peer. They're your child. And so yeah, we're gonna get into that. But yeah. But with that said, sir, I do thank you once again for having me tonight. It's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure.
Oh,
And
like
I do want to wish all the brothers in the chat a happy new year. Now I hope everything works out well for the brothers this year. I hope this new year is really a time of new beginnings. So
likewise, good sir. Always a pleasure. And what a way to start the new year. Go ahead and drop in another culture bomb. Cause it in this day and age it's needed. And definitely come tomorrow. Like I said, this is a good transition because for the first time, Doc, you'll be joining us on the Black Ronins
yeah, I don't.
podcast,
Yeah,
Intel.
I've never had the opportunity to join you brothers on that. So yeah, I definitely look forward to that tomorrow. So absolutely.
Right, right. Because I know Kitty Gakure, he got his articles, I got mine, and I know Doc from your medical background, you'll be able to kind of weave them all in to show like, well, yeah, you know, here's this and here's that. Because again, I think it's important that if I'll put it like this: if a gentleman is not interested in, family life and everything, that's fine. This information for the most part doesn't pertain to you. But if you are serious about that, you should be taking this information to heart because one wrong move, and like you said, Dr. Phoenix, you're going to have a seed of people where they see you as an enemy and not as a father.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it becomes commonplace. It's so commonplace now in Black America to see the children publicly denigrating and speaking ill of the father, especially among your celebrities, among your the entertainment class, where it's just so commonplace to see the children speak so ill of them. Their children never had to fight a battle a day in their life. For them. the most difficult decision they ever had to make was probably, am I going to drive the Maserati or pull out the Ferrari today?
Mm.
And the simple fact that for a lot of these entertainers, they came from what certainly could be considered humble means, and to have your children to sit here and publicly talk bad about you when you've spared them any of the difficulties you've had in your life. Yeah, that comes from when you choose the wrong woman. And having babies with the first woman that spreads the legs for you, black men still haven't figured this out, and now going into the 23rd year of the 21st century.
Ooh, Doc, I feel like we gotta make some more atomic bombs because this is getting pretty deep, pretty deep.
Yeah, yeah, I'll be cooking up a hydrogen bomb over here. So,
Well, Doc, once again, we want to thank you for the culture bomb and everything. So definitely looking forward to part 4 of the Black Cult because yeah, this at this point in time, I'm sorry, but Black Black America, you can't even say it's a culture now. It literally is a cult because when you purposely are trying to go against the grain of what other stable societies are doing and have been successfully doing for many years, yeah, yeah, that sounds more like a cult than it is a culture.
no, absolutely. I mean, essentially, Black America is quintessentially a cult of personalities. It's who we like best. Whoever Black folks like best, or better, or I should say, whoever best speaks to your pathology the best.
Exactly. And shout out to the Clue channel because he's also going to be doing a series on the Black Cult. So a lot of stuff we're doing right now, he's actually going to help carry over onto his panel and all his platforms. So definitely shout out to Clue to kind of giving us the idea of the Black Cult. But yeah, it's amazing. But with that said, just want to thank everybody for tuning in to this first podcast of 2023. Dr. Phoenix is the main host, so he is here for the Culture Bomb. I'm just the co-host, Sigma Jones. Until next time, people, stay safe out there. Tune in next time.